So in this week's video and also next week's video, I'm going to answer a question that I've had from one or two viewers, which is, can you summarise what all the excitement's about in relation to NGDP, nominal GDP? The new Bank of England Governor Mark Carney's come in and created a bit of a stir about whether the central bank should target whatever that number is. Now what I thought I'd do is step back. So in this video, I will cover what GDP is, because that's an important economic indicator in its own right. And then in next week's video, I will go on to elaborate on what the new measure, nominal GDP, might actually be all about and why a central bank would want to focus on that number right now. So with no more ado, GDP, gross domestic product, GDP. Very important indicator, essentially, of a country's economic health. All right, and there are various definitions of it. They vary a little bit, but one that I quite like is it is the monetary value of all finished goods and services produced within a country over a specified time period. So the monetary value of all finished goods and services produced within a country over a specified time period. Now, just to break that down a little bit, this is not a degree course, you'll be glad to know, it's a short, sharp video. But to break that down, there are actually two or three, I'd say three main ways that the GDP number can be calculated. And then we'll take a look at what it's supposed to be useful for, okay? So, how's it calculated? Well, there are about three methods. One is known as the output or production method, another is known as the expenditure method, another is known as the income method. Well, so what? They should, in theory, give about the same answer as to how healthy a particular economy like the UK actually is. So let's just take a look at one, just to give you a little bit more flavour about what's involved. And the answer is quite a lot of work, okay, to pull this one number together. So the expenditure method says, rather grand algebra coming up, but nothing too flash, says GDP is equal to C. This might look a bit surreal when I first write it down. C plus G plus I plus NX. They might be thinking, what on earth are you talking about? Well, the expenditure method sort of says, well, if you look at all the spending in the economy, you should get a feel for how healthy it is overall. Because the more economies are spending, presumably, the more it's kind of growing and so on and so forth. All right, so there's kind of the logic there. So C is consumer spending, roughly speaking. Okay. G is government spending. All right. I is business spending. Okay, and NX is net exports, or the gap between UK exports and imports. Okay, and one view of GDP, quite a common one, says if you can get all that data together on consumer spending, government spending, business spending, and net exports, get that all together, add it all up, you get an idea of what GDP might be. All right, in US dollars, if you're doing it for the US, for example. Okay. Now, how do they do it? It's quite a complex number to pull together. The answer is lots and lots of surveys. Okay, the government undertakes surveys. They ask thousands of businesses. All right, they ask different bits of the government. They literally ask them, tell us about your spending, tell us about your output, tell us about your income. Okay, and using one of those three approaches I described, this is just one of them. They build a picture of GDP. Right, and it takes a bit of time. And that's the reason why you get estimates, you get revisions to GDP. You might have seen in the newspapers, you suddenly get to a month and they say, we revised GDP for months ago. What's going on there? Well, to pull together all this data on these thousands of businesses and government departments and so on, what they try and do is issue a snapshot pretty soon after the latest quarter. This is sort of updated on a rolling quarterly basis. All right, they try and get a snapshot out, but that can be relatively inaccurate because they might have only done, the government that is, 50% of the surveying. So they try and get a number out, and then they say 18 months or even 2 years later, oh, we made a mistake, we'll revise it because now we've got better information about all this activity that was going on in a quarter we've already reported on. Okay, so it is subject to quite wide revisions, and that gets you into one of the problems of trying to get a snapshot on the health of an economy using one number. Yeah, garbage in, garbage out. GDP as a measure is only as good as the information that's chucked in to provide it. So, how's it used? I mean, what would you do with the GDP number? Well, the answer is, well, first of all, actually, one way it's used is to define recessions. So, GDP is often quoted as a rate. All right, so they'll say that the wealth, if you want to see it that way, of the economy is expanding by a certain percentage. Okay, and if it's doing the opposite, if a country is sort of shriveling, so GDP is actually reducing or shrinking, if you get 2 quarters, that's 2 3-month blocks back to back where that's happening consecutively, some economists say that's a recession. All right, so that's one use. It's actually used as a kind of technical recession indicator. Another use is simply benchmarking how one country is getting on against another. It's a sort of measurement tool, and there are various ways you can cut the GDP cake. All right, so for example, you can have the absolute number. You can have total GDP in the currency of your choice. All right, you can have GDP per capita. Broadly speaking, per person, okay? And you can have, obviously, the GDP growth rate, and all of them are quoted in different contexts. So just be a little bit careful. It's like any number, you can sort of start to tell a different story depending on which one you pick. So let's take an example. Globally, the country with the highest total GDP, normally quoted in dollars for obvious reasons, is America. Something like 20 to 25% of the world's wealth, if you want to see it that way, or output, is generated by the US at the moment, okay? But slice it another way, do GDP per capita per head, and the picture changes. Suddenly, looking at last year, for example, wealthy, tiny states like Qatar actually jump up the table because they got quite a bit of wealth, obviously not as much as the US, but not very many people, all right? And growth rate. Again, that tells a slightly different story. China gets disappointed when its growth rate drops below 8% a year. That's its GDP growth rate of change, okay? In the UK, that would be astonishing. I mean, you just wouldn't believe the number. In the UK, the long-term GDP growth rate is more like sort of 2.5%, and we're struggling to achieve anything like that at the moment, okay? So, it's used as a way of comparing countries and what's happening and sort of ranking them and rating them and so on. It's used as a way of generating a technical recession indicator. It's used as a kind of health barometer for the UK. And it has plenty of critics. All right, plenty of critics. Let me give you 2 or 3 criticisms and just finish with one alternative, the so-called GNP, or Gross National Product Number, which some people prefer, you will also see quoted. Okay, so what's wrong with this measure? I said it's the monetary value of finished goods and services produced within a country over a specified time period, for example, annually, right? Well, first of all, some things don't have a monetary value, but they add, you could say, to the health or wealth of the country, right? There's black market activity. That's not a monetary value sort of activity. To put it bluntly, people selling, drugs, for example, don't tend to issue invoices and declare their income. All right, but there's activity going on nonetheless. Or there might be, unpaid cash in hand cleaners working around the place, and none of that activity is being, well, it's very difficult to record, basically. So that can go missing, yet it's part of the picture of where a country is, for example. Free labour. Some people would say, well, there are people out there working for nothing. Okay, they're, I can't go to work unless someone else is looking after the house, for example. And if it happens to be my wife, that isn't recorded. It's activity of a sort. It's adding something to the nation, but it's not coming up in the GDP numbers. So there are people who say, well, there are various sort of flaws with the number, let alone the fact that collecting the data, even as it is tough enough, and that can lead to revisions and so on. Okay, and then there are people who say, well, the idea of it capturing stuff that's produced within a country is a bit of a strange one, because what do you actually mean? And this is where you get the GNP number coming in, gross national product. And GNP basically says what you want to capture is the value of stuff produced by UK residents, no matter where they happen to live. GDP is quite geography specific, okay? But have a think about it. For example, David Beckham. All right, he's been busy recently generating income out in America. Okay, he's paid by an LA football club. All right, so is the wealth being generated by David Beckham? Does that belong in the UK's numbers? Does it belong in the American numbers? Okay, and basically, the difference between the two is, in a way, a difference between GDP and GNP. Or take a Japanese car plant based up near Sunderland, for example, that sends most of its profits back to Japan. Whose wealth is that? Does that go on the Japanese scorecard, or does that go on the UK scorecard? And just to summarise, GDP would tend to say, well, the plant is here, so it's stuff that's being produced here, So it goes in our number, UK's number, but GNP would say, well, maybe that's not quite right. Maybe the contribution being made by that plant should primarily turn up in Japan's numbers, if you see what I mean. So, economists, part of the reason why GNP exists as a sort of rival to GDP is that economists debate this issue as to what is the correct way to measure a country's health and wealth over time. And I'll wrap up this video with just a couple of points. One is, in my next video, I shall use this as a platform to talk about nominal gross domestic product, a number being bandied around by central bankers right now. Okay? And I'll just finish by mentioning that if you want to get my videos delivered to your inbox free on a Thursday, all you need to do is go to www.moneyweek.com/Tim Bennett.